Hello, everybody, and welcome to my very first video of reading a book. This is specifically mostly going to be true crime novels. This one is titled A Rose for Her Grave. It is by Anne Rule. Um, I read this book um, many years ago, probably, and fortunately or unfortunately. Um, I have completely forgotten everything about this book. Um, I'm also reading off my Kindle, and I haven't been able to figure out how to put um, my Kindle onto my computer without having to pay for the app. Um, as soon as I am able, maybe to do that and pay for the Kindle app, I'll get that on there, and then we will read along together. Okay. Um, but for now, what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm gonna read off the Kindle. I can't sit here for long periods of time. So what I thought I would do is read maybe a chapter or two at a time, um, and to post the video to YouTube. Um, and then once the book's done, everything will be put into series on my YouTube channel. All right, so without further ado, here we go. So this is going to start out with the author's note. It says, this is from again Anne Rule. She says, I've always believed that true crime writing should not only absorb its readers, but also educate them. There is no need to embroider spectacular cases. Human behavior is in and of itself more fascinating than anything to be found in fiction. Those who have read my work before know that I do not stress blood and gore and grotesque details. I focus my research on the whys of murder more than on the how. Every day, perfectly normal appearing people commit crimes that seem inexplicable, leaving the rest of us to ponder what happened. And there are the monsters, too, who make us ask, why did it take so long to happen? This series will, I hope, break new ground in the true crime genre. This book, by the way, was written back in, I think, 1993. And she goes on to say, each volume is designed to stand on its own, unveiling the details of aberrant and criminal behavior in the format that suits a particular case best. And yet, the entire series will give the reader a deeper understanding of the psychopathology behind many types of crime. I do believe she is talking about her true crime series. Um, but anyways, among the 1,400 murder cases I have covered, there are many that I will never forget. They have become so much a part of my life that the families of the victims are still my friends, and so are the detectives who caught the killers. I cannot really tell you why these cases are so real to me today as they were the first time I delved into the police files and visited the places where the human beings involved once walked. It may be because these stories are, in a shadowy, frightening way, classics. In Volume 1, the title story covers the case of Randy Roth, a modern day Bluebeard whose alleged crimes went unpunished for more than a decade. The Roth case is is an original book length piece written expressly for this anthology. Randy Roth's trial was held in 1992. You will also find other true cases from my archives. These have been revised and updated. Campbell's Revenge, The hit person, equal opportunity murder, the runaway, the rehabilitation of a monster, and Molly's murder. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and we will start the chapter 1. Janice. Janice Miranda was a little bit of a thing. She stood no more than an inch over 5 feet tall, and she weighed only 98 pounds. The few snapshots of her that remain are blurry. Even so, it was easy to see that she was pretty. She had long, glossy brown hair and green eyes, and a good figure that she kept by jogging and dancing. She admitted that jogging bored her, but she loved to dance. Oh, how she loved to dance. On the dance floor, she could forget the sad times in her short life, too many failed dreams, and too many broken promises. Her natural grace and a lot of practice drew admiring glances from other dancers, and she never lacked for partners. Janice left home young. When she set off on her own, her mother, Billie Jean Ray, was living in Dallas, Texas, and her father was off in Little Rock, Arkansas. At least, he was the last time his daughter had heard from him. He had gone off and left Billie Jean with all the responsibility of raising their 4 kids. As long as Janice as long as Janice could remember, Billie Jean had worked 3 jobs at a time. Her mother was more philosophical about her husband than Janice was. She saw how exhausted Billie Jean was most of the time, and she would never forgive her father for what she perceived as desertion. When he tried to make up later by sending Janice birthday cards and offering to send small sums of money, she told him, "If you want to help somebody, start sending checks to mom. Once you've caught up with all that you owe her, then you can think about your children." There have been many times when there have been many times when food was scarce, and Janice never forgot them. It wasn't easy for her to believe in men after her daddy took off, and yet her emotions were ambivalent. She longed for a good man, and she was doubled that such an animal existed. And she doubted that such an animal existed. I also forgot to mention that during these videos, you'll likely experiencing some pauses. Um, my fiance does call quite a bit when he's working. He works on the road. Um, and I have to get up and stretch. Um, I did have to just pause. So in case you see that in the video, that's why. I'm going to go ahead and continue though. It says, nevertheless, Janice married young at the first time. Janice married young the first time. She had known Joe Miranda for a year or so, and she was 18 when she and Joe got married on April 17th of 1971. Joe was in the army and they transferred to Augsburg, Germany, where their daughter Jolena was born October 10th, 1973. When they returned to Dallas, Janice worked at several jobs, first as a lab assistant and then as and then for a security firm and a stockbroker. The romance went out of their marriage too soon, and Joe and Janice separated in late 1971. Their divorce was final on September 16th, 1976. There were no bitter recriminations. They simply went their separate ways, and 24-year-old Janice got custody of Jelena. Somewhat reluctantly, according to Janice, Joe paid $250 a month toward Jelena's support. Janice tried to save most of that for her little girl's future. She found herself working as hard as her own mother had just to cover the necessities of life for herself and Jelena. She couldn't hope to get much help from her family. They were working to keep afloat themselves. Janice Miranda was a young woman of moderate habits. Occasionally, she would have a drink or two when she was out dancing, but that was all. Drinking was against her religion, and besides that, the music and the excitement that she always found at a dance were enough of a high for her. Janice fantasized sometimes that she could be a professional disco dancer, and she also loved to dance to the big band sound. She didn't use drugs except for diet pills once in a while. She was so tiny that her friends wondered why she felt the need to watch her weight, but she complained that every extra pound showed when you were short. If she went over 105 pounds, she worried. Janice, with Jelena in tow, moved often, looking perhaps for some geographic solution to the melancholy that periodically washed her world in shades of gray. She went from Texas to California and then on up to Washington State. She didn't have anything in the way of earthly possessions, but she had what was most important, her daughter. Jelena's hair was a little darker than her mother's, but just as thick and gleaming with highlights. Janice combed Jelena's hair back and caught it up with a ribbon, letting it cascade to her daughter's waist. Mother and daughter were close, perhaps too close. Sometimes Janice confided too much in her child. She told Jelena almost everything. That's more than a little kid should know, Janice's friends cautioned more than once. But Janice shook her head. Jelena and I don't have any secrets between us. During and after her marriage to Joe, Janice was a Jehovah's Witness. She was heavy into religion, Joe remembered. She was always looking for something to belong to. Her family broke up after a divorce, and Janice was kicked around a lot from family to family. As an adult, Janice was close to her mother, sisters, and brother, and she had one person she could count on, her friend Louise Mitchell. The women met at their church in Dallas in 1975. Louise was a little older and had kids of her own, but the two women hit it off right away. Janice's size could make her seem almost waif like sometimes, as if she needed someone who gave a damn about her. Louise did. They had similar problems, and the two women sometimes combined their households to save expenses. They got along fine. They trusted each other so much that they shared a bank account on occasion. Then one or the other would move, and the friendship would continue with long distance calls and letters. Janet still longed for a man who would truly love her, but now that would mean loving Jelena too. Janice was young and attractive, and most of the time she managed to show the world an upbeat attitude, even when she was sad and scared underneath. Half of her believed in fate and in love at first sight. Half of her clung to her own autonomy and made her treasure her independence. Pressed to reveal her real feelings, Janice admitted she believed she would have a second chance at love. Sometimes Janice leapt without thinking, making decisions based on emotion rather than on common sense. She seemed to change her mind as often as she changed her clothes. The one thing she was absolutely steadfast about was her daughter. Jelena always came first. Janice would have given up her life for her little girl. Louise Mitchell had seen Janice discouraged and depressed, but not often. The only time she was really concerned was when they were living in California. Janice had looked up upon the move to California as a whole new start, only to find that there was nothing magical there either. It was Still hard to make a living and support Jelena, and sometimes she got so lonely. When Louise moved to Seattle in 1979, Janice followed a few months later and found an apartment right across the street from Louise's place. She hadn't found happiness in Texas or in California, and she missed having her best friend around. They fell immediately back into their old habit of visiting together every day, either on the phone or over coffee. Janice soon got a job working in the office at the Richmond Pediatric Clinic on North 108th in the North End suburb of Seattle. The move from Texas had taken everything she had saved, except for Jelena's college money. She wouldn't touch Jelena's savings if she could help it. Janice had only her 1974 Pinto. She had no furniture at all and no clothes for cold weather. One of the other women working at the clinic loaned her a little television set, and she was surprised and shocked when she brought it over to see that Janice and Jelena slept on the floor of their small apartment in sleeping bags because they had no beds. They were using a suitcase for a table. But neither mother nor daughter seemed to feel bad about it. They were camping out until they could afford furniture. Janice was a good worker and everyone liked her at the clinic. She never complained about what she didn't have. She just worked harder to change things. She took a job at Kmart in the evenings. Shirley Lenz, the clinic receptionist, recalled. She wanted Jelena to have whatever she needed. Janice herself didn't have a winter coat. She had to have two jobs to make it. If only on a subconscious level, Janice Miranda waited for a prince to come along and rescue her. She knew that wasn't likely to happen. Still, she could hope. She knew that wasn't likely to happen, still, she could hope. Every time she went to a dance, she wondered if it might turn out to be her lucky night. She joined Parents Without Partners and attended all their dances. She went to their Halloween party and then to the PWP Thanksgiving dance. Faces in the crowd began to seem like friends. Janice went to a Parents Without Partners New Year's Eve dance on the last day of 1980. It was held at a dance hall over the Richmond Highlands Ice Arena. As always, there were 4 times as many women attending as men. The women brought the chips and dip and cheese trays and leftover Christmas cookies, and the men brought themselves, fully aware that their very scarcity made them desirable. Most of the celebrants were over 40. Janice didn't really expect New Year's Eve to be any different from the rest of her nights. She just wanted to dance. Jelena was safe with the babysitter, and Janice knew she looked especially pretty in one of her few good dresses. Okay, I am back. I had to answer the phone again and put up my hair because it is hot in this room. All right, so back to where we were. When she heard a soft voice behind her asking for a dance, she turned around and got a pleasant surprise. She had danced with a man holding out his hand before, although they had never really talked. His name was Randy something. He wasn't very tall, but he had a wonderfully muscular physique, warm brown eyes, and a luxuriant mustache. He was handsome and he was young. He looked no more than 25. He couldn't dance more than rudimentary steps, but that didn't matter. Suddenly, they were talking as if they had known each other for a long time. He made no move to leave her side all evening. Maybe it was the thought that she wasn't really alone on New Year's Eve any longer. Maybe it was her sense that the physical attraction between them was very strong. Whichever, Janice was both thrilled and fascinated with Randy Roth. He had told her he had just celebrated his 26th birthday on the day after Christmas. He had been married once, but his divorce had been final on May 20th. He said he had a little boy, Greg, who was 3. He was raising his son by himself. She was touched by that. Right away, they had something in common. Janice looked at the picture Randy carried of his son and saw an adorable, chubby cheeked little boy. It was obvious to her that Randy loved his child as fiercely as she loved Jelena. As 1981 arrived and the crowd whooped and whistled, Janice Miranda was already half in love. Inwardly, she marveled at that. She was the woman who didn't trust men. She had been bruised in the wars of love too many times, but this man was different, somehow special. When Randy Roth asked if he might call her, she agreed enthusiastically. And then she held her breath until he did call. So many men said they would and then never did. Randy did. He seemed to be as interested in her as she was in him. Her friend Louise and her coworkers at the clinic warned her to be cautious, but Janice just shook her head and smiled. The more time she spent with Randy, the more she thanked her lucky stars. He was the dearest, sweetest, and most romantic man she had ever known. His own life hadn't been easy. He trusted her enough to confide in her about his service in the Marine Corps in Vietnam, but only to a point. She sensed he was holding some of the horror back so that he wouldn't upset her. All he seemed to care about was her happiness. She had never known anyone like that before. Janice came to work one morning just beaming, Shirley Lenz would later recall. She was carrying a little bouquet of flowers and a note. Randy had left them on her car. She just couldn't get over that. She thought it was wonderful. When Randy sent Janice a dozen red roses, she was even more enchanted with him. If she had sat down and written out exactly what she wanted in a man, her list would have described Randy Roth. Except for the fact that he was only a passable dancer, he was perfect. She told Louise that Randy had held a steady job as a diesel mechanic for Vitamilk Dairy for a long time, and that he wanted the same things out of life that she wanted: a happy family, a home with a mother and a father to take care of both Greg and Jelena. Randy told her that he was renting a house with an option to buy it. He had lived in the Linwood, Washington area most of his life. Randy seemed solid to Janice, not like the fly-by-night guys she had met before. Although Janice wasn't thrilled with working out and jogging, she accompanied Randy in those pursuits, puffing along behind him, but grinning gamely. If Randy had wanted her to, she would have lifted weights and swum the English Channel. He was a stickler for physical fitness, and she wanted to be just the kind of woman he admired. When she saw how he detested smoking, she quickly quit. She hoped he would never find out that she had smoked. Loving Randy's son, Greg, was easy for Janice. He was a sweet little boy who didn't even remember his real mother. Janice was ready to be Greg's mother if Randy wanted her to be. Both Louise Mitchell and Shirley Lenz kept warning Janice to slow down. What did she really know about Randy? She just laughed and told them she knew enough to know she wanted to marry him and live with him for the rest of her life. Shirley had never even met Randy, but he sounded like the perfect man for Janice. Maybe too perfect. She suggested to Janice that a perfect man would be willing to wait a few more months. Real love could stand the test of time. From Janice's description of their dating, it sounded as though they were racing toward a serious commitment. Shirley's suspicions were right on target. One morning in February, Janice rushed into work and showed her coworkers her left hand. She wore a ring with a tiny diamond on her third finger. "He's gonna take care of me," she cried joyously. "Randy's gonna marry me and take care of me." Janice Miranda and Randy Roth were married in a civil ceremony in municipal court in Seattle on March 13th of 1981. They took a short honeymoon to Victoria, British Columbia on Vancouver Island. It was only 3 ferry boat rides away and a short drive from the Linwood Everett area. Culturally, it was a world away. The historic Empress Hotel where they stayed seemed so grand and European, with its majestic structure and the afternoon high tea it was famous for. Janice was dazzled by the splendor and romance. After the honeymoon, Janice and Jelena moved into Randy's rented house at 4029 42nd Place West in Mount Lake Terrace, Washington. At his urging, Janice quit her job and stayed home to be a mother to the 2 children of their new family. She felt a little guilty because Randy was bringing so much into the marriage, at least financially, and she had nothing to contribute but her love. Randy told her he had $250,000 worth of insurance on his life and that he had changed the policy so that she was the beneficiary. 3 weeks after they were married, Janice applied for a daycare license, had the house inspected, and it opened a child care center in their home. The first of her 4 toddlers came at 6 a.m., and Jen was busy all day. She even kept one child from 10 p.m. until 4 a.m. for a registered nurse who worked a night shift at a nearby hospital. Jan didn't earn very much, $1.25 an hour during the day and $1.50 at night. But she had children. There are 16 hours a day for 5 days a week. Randy worked at Vitamilk from 7:30 a.m. until 5 p.m. He made $14.39 an hour, plus time and a half when he worked overtime. He led Janice to believe that he earned close to $30,000 a year. Janice and Randy hadn't been married long when Janice told Louise that someone had stolen her car. Louise thought that was almost laughable. 7-year-old Pintos were not exactly the most desirable targets for car thieves, not like Camaros or Pontiac Firebirds. Besides, Janice acted strange when she talked about it. Actually, she didn't want to talk about it at all, and she avoided Louise's questions. She had insurance on the car, however, and she and Randy accepted a cash settlement. What was left of the Pinto turned up a couple of months later, stripped and abandoned. In the beginning, Janice was deliriously happy in her marriage. Everybody who knew her was happy for her. It was Louise Mitchell who first became aware that things in the Ross marriage might not be as blissful as they had been. While Randy had been an ardent lover during his headlong pursuit of Janice, she confided to Louise that he had cooled off rapidly. Even their honeymoon had been a disappointment. Randy told Janice that intercourse was painful for him because of an infection that set in after he had a vasectomy. Janice didn't understand male physiology and she was puzzled. Still, she accepted his explanation, although she was disappointed that the physical side of their marriage was so diminished. Randy also had a private area of his life that Janice worried about. During their whirlwind courtship, he hadn't talked about other women, but she had been around enough to assume that he'd had lovers in his past, just as she had. She did not expect that he would continue to see his old girlfriends. Janice was not happy to discover that Randy was still very close to Lily Vanderveer, being a fictitious name, a married woman who had been Greg's babysitter. He often had lunch alone with her. Indeed, he sometimes still had her babysit with Greg, which was ridiculous because Janice was available to care for Greg. Jelena told her mother that when Randy went to pick Greg up at Lily's house, he always made her stay in the car. Randy laughed at Jan's questions about Lily. She just wants my attention, he explained. There's nothing romantic about it. Jan wanted her husband's attention too, and she was not getting much of it. Before her second marriage was 3 months old, Janice Miranda Roth began to worry that Randy might be seeing other women, and then she berated herself for being so suspicious. It was her own lack of confidence, she reasoned, and nothing that Randy was doing. After all, hadn't Randy brought up the idea of their buying a house? A man who had fallen out of love with his wife wouldn't do that. She tried to tell herself that they were building a future together and that Randy was simply a man who did not desert his old friends. Sometimes she had to try very hard to talk herself out of the jealous thoughts that crept into her mind. Everything was so different after their wedding. The romantic gestures that Janice had appreciated so much during their courtship had long since stopped. There were no more nosegays or love notes, no more roses. Janice no longer felt as if Randy saw her as the center of his universe. She rationalized that disappointment away too. Randy was working hard, and so was she. Roses cost money, and they were saving to buy the house. She would be foolish to expect their relationship to continue as it had before they were married. Still, Randy's tender and impulsive gestures had ended so suddenly that it was almost as if he had thrown cold water in her face. One day, she had been basking in his complete devotion. The next, she felt like a babysitter. Her husband seemed so closed off to her, his face void of expression. His attitude toward her often almost one of annoyance. She couldn't understand what had happened. Feeling disloyal, she confided again in Louise Mitchell. Sometimes I wonder if I didn't get married too quickly. Does he hit you? Louise asked. Nothing like that. He's just different. Louise ventured her opinion that her friend's husband seemed to be wound up too tight. She felt that Randy was capable of violence, and she warned Janice to be careful. Janice shook her head. No, it wasn't that. She didn't know for sure what was wrong. They could sit down and talk things out calmly, and they often did. I just worry about things, she admitted. He lives so dangerously. He drives so fast, and he's so jealous of me. He's got no reason to be. I never even look at anyone else. Like Jan, who had been slow to tell her family about her marriage, Randy didn't seem anxious to introduce her to his mother or his siblings. In fact, she had no idea where they lived, nor had she heard any details about them. She would have been shocked to realize how close by they lived. However, they did visit Randy's father, Gordon, and his stepmother, Sandy, in southwest Washington in July of 1981. They went camping during their vacation and drove down the coast, pulling a trailer. They camped at Ocean Shores in Washington and then at a campground in Astoria, Oregon, before they arrived in the little town of Washougal, where Gordon lived. Gordon was built much like Randy, muscular and compact, and he was a strong man too. The elder Roth had a small farm near Washougal, and Randy helped his father harvest a crop of hay, something he had done often in the past. Janice liked her stepmother in law and Randy's step siblings, Marcy, age 13, John, age 9, and JR, age 7. Jelena was thrilled to learn that Marcy had two horses, Stardust and Dusty. Randy, Janice, Jelena, who was 7, and Greg, now 3, camped at Beacon Rock State Park, about 15 miles east of Washougal along the Columbia River Gorge. Randy suggested that they hike up Beacon Rock itself. Although Janice was not an avid hiker, she was swept up in Randy's enthusiasm, at least until she saw Beacon Rock up close. Beacon Rock was more of a mountain than a rock. It was a huge monolith that rose up out of the earth more than 500 feet into the sky. High up at its summit, it looked forbidding and dangerous. There was only stone up there. 8 or 9 stubborn fern trees clung to its inhospitable surface. Janice confided that she was terrified of heights, but Randy assured her there was easy hiking trails that even the children could manage. With his coaxing and soothing, Janice nodded nervously and said she would give it a try. They took Marcy and John along and charged up the huge rock. The kids did just fine, maybe because their center of gravity was so low. The trail was well marked, and it had handrails and numerous switchbacks to ease the uphill climb. Even so, it wasn't for sissies. There were many other vacationers climbing along with them. Randy walked out on one shortcut about 200 feet from the top, and Janice saw other people ducking under the handrails, but she hung back. She knew she would get dizzy if she looked down. She kept a close eye and grip on Jelena and Greg to be sure they stayed well back from the edge of the trail where the earth ended suddenly in nothing but a few scraggly shrubs and air. Janice felt much better when they were back down on flat ground. She was relieved when they headed north to Seattle, leaving the looming bulk of stone behind them. Back home, Janice and Randy went ahead with their plans to buy a house. In August, they found a place they could afford, also in Mountain Lake Terrace. The community was Seattle's answer to the East Coast Levittowns built during the post-World War II building boom. Just off the I-5 freeway, halfway between Seattle and Everett, it was the first town of any size to the north. Young couples flocked to buy the new homes that sprouted up as quickly as mushrooms, with only the color of the paint and other minor cosmetic differences distinguishing one from the other. Randy's service in the Marines allowed him to get a VA loan to buy the new house at 6207 229th Southwest. It cost $59,950, and there was no down payment required, only closing costs. Randy's rent for the old house had been just $250 a month. Now their mortgage payments were almost $900 a month, and it would be years before they built up any real equity in the new house. But it was theirs, not a rental. Janice was so excited about having her own home. Mountlake Terrace wasn't as popular an area as it had been 3 decades before. There were scores of new subdivisions around Seattle and Everett now, and the newness had worn off. The house wasn't fancy, but it was a huge step up from an apartment with no beds or tables. When they bought the little house, Janice felt slightly guilty that she had complained about Randy to Louise, even though she had discovered that Randy had only a part-time job as a mechanic for Vitamilk. He was the one who had made their buying a house possible. Her babysitting chores didn't bring in enough money to make much of a difference. It doesn't seem right, Janice told Louise, mentioning again Randy's $250,000 insurance policy. The policy, had stressed, was there to ensure that Greg and Jelena would always be taken care of. Randy has all that insurance and I don't have any. He wants us both to get a policy, and that seems fair to me. That way, I'll be evening up the financial burden a little. Randy had made an appointment with Daryl Lundquist, an insurance agent for Farmers New World Life. Lundquist explained that both Randy and Janice were eligible for a VIP non smoking policy with a payoff value of $100,000 and that the premiums would be negligible, only $15.90 a month apiece. Since they were both under 30 and lived clean and healthy lives, they were just the kind of clients that insurance companies wanted. This way, Randy told Janice, we will have mortgage insurance. If either of us should die, the other would be able to pay off the house and look after Jelena and Greg without worrying about losing our home. Sounded reasonable to Janice. On September 26, 1981, identical insurance policies were issued to the Roths by Farmers New World Life. They would go into effect in early November. Randy's beneficiary was, of course, his wife Janice. He listed a neighbor couple, Ron and Nancy Aiden, who had become close friends, as secondary beneficiaries. Janice listed Randy first and the Aidens second. The Aidens belonged to the Baptist Church in Silver Lake that she and Randy attended, although Randy wasn't as faithful about attending services as Janice was. Randy seemed to have a real talent for making friends. His longest friendship was with Nick Amandi, again a pseudonym, whom he had known since 1977 when Amandi was only 19. They had been friends during the time Randy was married to his first wife, Donna Carlson Sanchez, who was Greg's mother. Donna had lived with Randy in the rented house he later shared with Janice. When Randy and Donna divorced, Nick had helped to move Donna over to Eastern Washington. She had a little girl by her first marriage and apparently agreed to let Randy have custody of Greg. Beyond that, Jan knew practically nothing about Donna. Randy and Nick Amandi punched the same time clock at Vitamilk Dairy, and they both were into fixing up cars and riding motorcycles. Randy seemed to be the leader and Nick the follower. Randy liked to control me, Nick would recall years later. He used the carrot and the stick approach. He would either give you something or punish you, so you'd do what he wanted. Nick was married and had a small daughter. Janice and Carrie Amandi were friendly, but it was mainly because of their husbands' long camaraderie. Janice hadn't told her family in Dallas that she had married again. Not at first. Maybe she was afraid they would question her impetuous decision after such a short courtship. Maybe she wanted time alone with Randy before they revealed their somewhat checkered family histories. She and Randy had been together for months before she broke the news. Once she told her mom, Billie Jean Ray, that she was married, she wrote to her often and seemed eager for Billie Jean and her sisters Cleta and Sharon and the rest of her family to accept and admire Randy. On October 12th, 1981, Janice sent a long letter to Billie Jean. It was good to talk to you again, Janice began. She told her mother that Jolena was now 4 feet 5 inches tall and weighed 65 pounds. Janice explained that she was not working outside the home and that it was good to be there when Jolena came home from school. She said that she was babysitting for a 1-year-old and a 4-year-old and hoped to build up to more clients. Greg's 4th birthday was coming up, Janice noted, and he made his own bed and helped her with chores. He's quite mature because Randy would not tolerate a sissy boy. Janice's affection for Greg was obvious. He is a good boy most of the time. Janice's letter was cheerful as she described the aftermath of Greg's attempt to shave when he cut himself and how he had come home from playing with dog mess in his hair. Kids are kids. Janice told her mother that Greg told her she looked pretty as she fixed her hair and makeup every evening before Randy came home. She told her mother that Randy was 5 feet 7.5 inches tall and weighed about 155 pounds, and that he was very strong. He was a former karate champion with trophies to prove it. He doesn't do it much anymore. He'd get so involved that he couldn't sleep. Perhaps protesting too much, Janice wrote that Randy has many very good qualities. Sometimes he has drawbacks. His drawbacks are due to the years he spent in Vietnam. He used to have nightmares, some depression after his tour there. You probably wouldn't believe some of the things he had to do there. He isn't proud of them, but it's either you or the army. Also, if you don't do what you're told, then you go to the stockade. If we ever had another war and Randy got drafted, I wouldn't let him go. So many guys get messed up in Nam. That was a dumb war. The world itself can make you a hard, cold person, but so can war. He had to learn to be human again, if you can understand that. Janice hastened to assure her mother that Randy had never used any type of drug, and when they went out, they drank very moderately. She had never seen Randy even tipsy, and he had never smoked. As for her love affair with dancing, Janice wrote that she and Randy only went out dancing once every 6 weeks. She complained jokingly that she was getting old and that at 29, she couldn't keep up the way she could when she was only 25. I don't take getting too old to disco lightly. Janice complimented Billy on getting a good job as a housekeeper for a wealthy couple and wrote nostalgically about the good old Texas home cooking which she missed. She said Randy didn't care for vegetables much, and she tried to cook only the things he preferred. Janice wrote about the weather and the beautiful and hot summer the Northwest had just had. Temperatures had soared over 100 degrees. She was annoyed with her sister Cleta for giving her father her mailing address, which she still listed as Louise Mitchell's house, because she didn't want him to write her. If he really ever cared about us, he would have sent you child support when he was working. When he has paid you a couple of $1,000 of back child support, then I'll speak to him. He forgot his responsibility to us, and now I forget mine to him since I don't live a Christian life anymore. Janice wrote that she lived according to her own standards, as most people seemed to. Although Janice was no longer a practicing Jehovah's Witness, she did attend church and she was living a Christian life, but she was very hard on herself. Think I'm bitter? She wrote. Damn right I am. I only appreciate those worth appreciating. That's my own opinion. It took me years and years to realize all this. He didn't care if we had clothes or food to eat, now did he? Whatever her father had done to make amends, Janice felt it wasn't enough. He had once offered to take Jelena to ease her burden. That wasn't the answer. I was the problem, not Jelena, she wrote, explaining that several times in her life, Jelena was the reason for her to keep trying. She loves her mama, and I needed that. It was a strangely ambivalent letter, sounding happy and confident, but with an undercurrent of what? It was more than bitterness over a lost childhood, a kind of dread, perhaps. It felt good, she wrote, reversing herself again, to know that it was no longer I alone who was taking care of a family. Janice concluded, I am the most secure and generally the happiest I've ever been. But sometimes I don't know if that's what I want. Sometimes playing housewife isn't always fun. Sometimes I miss my independence. Randy is good to all of us and fair. But I sometimes remember liking to be my own boss. Janice Miranda Roth told her mother that she had never had so much in the way of worldly goods, even though she and Randy longed for things they couldn't yet afford. They wanted a basement and a second bathroom, and money was tight. Their house payments took $871 a month, and the rest went for groceries, utilities, and insurance. This house is half mine, and if I choose to leave, I forfeit all rights. That's how the contract was written. Janice closed her letter, saying, I do love Randy very much. However, sometimes I ask myself, is love really worth it? I don't know that answer yet. Bye. Janice enclosed money for her mother's birthday. She didn't explain. Is love really worth what? Billie Jean Ray never got another letter from Janice Roth, nor did anyone else. That's the end of chapter 1. Chapter 2. On Halloween, Randy Roth and his friend Nick Amandi took Nick's daughter and Greg and Jelena out trick-or-treating. The men talked as they waited in the road while the excited children ran across the lawns, giggling to knock on doors. Afterward, Nicomandi could not recall how they got into a conversation whose topic was macabre enough to fit right in with the foggy, dark Halloween night. Could you kill your wife? Randy had asked Nick suddenly. What? Nick was startled. What do you mean? I mean, under certain circumstances, if you had to. Randy gave examples of situations where a man might kill his wife to save her from something far worse. What if we were invaded? Randy continued. What if the Russians were coming and you knew she was going to be tortured or raped? Could you kill her first? Amandi shook his head, chilled at the thought. Jan asked me if I could kill her if something like that happened, Randy explained, as if they were carrying on the most normal conversation in the world. Amandi changed the subject and tried to shrug off Randy's questions as Halloween spookiness, but he remembered the conversation for years. Randy had an intensity about him, a way of speaking softly and staring at someone with his brown eyes fixed. Sometimes he came up with the weirdest thoughts. Nick hadn't realized it, but Jan Roth had felt a chill for a long time, a sense of foreboding that drained the sunshine from her heart the way the northwest rains washed the sky of light. In the space of 7 months, she had gone from a bubbly bride to a woman with circles under her eyes who seemed always to be watching for something behind her, something creeping up on her. When Louise Mitchell questioned her about what was wrong, Janice just bit her lip and looked away. Her marriage wasn't happy. That was patently clear to Louise. She knew Janice and had seen her put up with all manner of disappointments and still hide her pain from the world. This was something different. Janice didn't talk about Randy the way she had. There was no joy in her at all. Finally, she acknowledged quietly to her best friend that she had made a mistake. She had even begun to think of leaving her husband, although she had nothing but Jelena's college fund to see them through. Janice believed that if she left, she would have no claim at all on the property she and Randy now co-owned. Louise felt her skin prickle with goosebumps. It almost seemed that Janice was afraid of Randy. By November 1981, Nick Amandi saw the same depression in his friend's wife. One morning, Randy asked Nick to drive him to work. He said he was leaving on a hunting trip and didn't want to park his car at Vitamilk overnight. Nick obliged, using Randy's car, although he was puzzled. He had never known Randy to hunt. He felt sure that if Randy was staying away overnight, he wasn't going hunting for deer or elk. After he dropped Randy off, Nick drove the car back to the little house in Mount Lake Terrace. He stopped in to say hi to Jan and found a very sad and frightened woman. She said she was scared of dying, Amandi remembered later. I just know she wasn't happy. Why on earth would a perfectly healthy 29-year-old woman be afraid of dying? He wondered. Janice was still jogging and exercising. She was in great shape. She had every right to expect to be around for another 50 or 60 years. Nick Amandi couldn't cheer her up, and he left, perplexed. On November 25th, Janice asked Jelena to come into the master bedroom with her. She had something important to tell her, something that no 8-year-old child should ever have to deal with. Jelena, Janice said hopelessly, You know I love you, and I want to stay with you forever and ever. But if anything should happen to me, if I'm not here, I want you to know I have some money put away. It's for you. Janice showed Jelena the hiding place she had selected. She pulled out a drawer in a cabinet built into the wall. There was a white envelope taped to the back of the drawer. She showed her daughter the thick clump of bills inside. Remember, honey, if I'm gone, I want you to come in here and take this and hide it. Jelena nodded, but she was worried. Why was her mother talking like that? It scared her. Worried and frightened enough, Janice might have dipped into Jelena's money to get away from whatever she feared. Janice had promised Billy Ray that she and Jelena would come to Texas for either Christmas or New Year's, but she hadn't said one word about bringing Randy along. As far as anyone knew, their marriage was still a going concern. Randy gave no indication that there were problems. On November 7th, 1981, Randy's and Jan's identical VIP $100,000 insurance policies had gone into effect. They continued to work and fixing up their new home in Mount Link Terrace. Janice had made no move to leave her husband. It is likely she hoped that her fears were groundless and that things would go back to the way they had been at first. She had loved Randy so much when she married him. She had loved their life together until all the affection and sharing trickled away. Jan had no idea what she had done wrong. All the makeup and dressing up for Randy's homecoming and all her efforts to cook his favorite foods were met with a blank stare. Sometimes she thought he hated her. Sometimes she blamed Vietnam and what that terrible war had done to him. More often, she blamed herself. Randy announced that they would be going down to visit his father and stepmother in Washougal for Thanksgiving dinner. Janice was enthusiastic about the trip when she told Louise about it. Although she didn't look forward to the long drive, she liked Randy's family. Gordon and Sandy Roth were having their own marital problems and had separated, but they lived just across Southeast 380th Avenue from each other. It was an amicable parting. Randy still felt comfortable visiting them in their separate homes. He and Janice would stay at the farm with Sandy, though. Garden, Gordon Roth's bachelor cottage was tiny. Thanksgiving Day went well. The kids had a good time, and no one in Washougal sensed any strain at all between the newlyweds. They all talked about Christmas and where they would spend the holiday. On Friday morning, November 27th, 1981, Randy and Janice prepared to go Christmas shopping. When the kids heard about their plans, they all clamored to go. But Randy said no. This was just for Jan and him. They needed some time to be together. The weather was chilly but sunny, and he wanted to get started at once. He turned down Sandy Roth's offer to make her usual pancake breakfast for company. Marcy Roth and her little brothers were disappointed about that. Sandy didn't bother making pancakes just for the kids. Jelena didn't care. She was excited about spending the day with Marcy and riding the horses. Jan seemed happy to go shopping with Randy. In fact, she seemed to be happy and enthusiastic about the Thanksgiving weekend in general. It was her first real holiday as Randy's wife. And now there was a Christmas coming up when she and Jelena wouldn't be alone anymore. If she still had doubts about her marriage and fears about something unknown waiting to destroy her happiness, she gave no indication of them. But Randy and Janice didn't go Christmas shopping after all. As Randy explained later, they were barely down the road toward the huge shopping mall at Jansen Beach on the Columbia River when Janice asked him if they could change their plans. She suggested we climb Beacon Rock, Randy said. She thought it would be romantic for us to climb up alone. Janice wore jeans and a bright pink ski jacket with white fake fur trim. Randy wore his street clothes and a jacket. Neither had shoes meant for rough terrain. It didn't matter. It wasn't as if they would be going mountain climbing. Randy reminded Jan that Beacon Rock had a trail where they could walk side by side, at least as they started up. Last summer's climb hadn't been nearly as scary as she expected, had it? Skamania County, Washington, is one of the state's least populated counties, with much of its landmass covered over with forests and mountains. The Gifford Pinchot National Forest sprawls across Skamania County and the Cascade Range, whose infamous Mount St. Helens erupted on May 18, 1980, thrust skyward from the land. Here's the Indian Haven Wilderness and the Trapper Creek Wilderness. Skamania's small towns crouch along the great Columbia River at the bottom of the county. Underwood, Home Valley, Carson, North Bonneville, Skamania, and Stevenson, the county seat. Except for its natural wonders, Skamania is not a rich county. It is a world away from the industry of Seattle and of Portland, Oregon. Its income even more depleted with the slump in the timber industry and a battle between the environmentalists and the loggers over the rights of the spotted owl. With the exception of an occasional drunken shootout and one tragically memorable family mass murder, Skamania County has a markedly low homicide rate. Lawmen are far more likely to have to deal with highway accidents and mishaps suffered by tourists. It is true now, and it was true in 1981. It was 11:23 on the morning of November 27th when case number 81-3885 began to unfold in the Skamania County Sheriff's Office. The day after Thanksgiving had been quiet for deputies on duty until Deputy E.L. Powell was instructed to respond to a possible fall victim at Beacon Rock. There was very little information available on the incident, if, indeed, there had been a fall. Powell asked that a team from Skamania County Search and Rescue respond. "Better roust Ray out, too," he said quietly into his radio mic. Ray was Under Sheriff Ray Blaisdell. People didn't fall off Beacon Rock and walk away with a sprained ankle. If the report was true, the news could be bad. They had perhaps 4 hours of daylight to locate a fall victim. When Deputy Powell got to the Beacon Rock trailhead 10 minutes later, he was met by a worried-looking young woman who said her name was Shelley Anderson. She said her party of climbers, her husband, Steve Anderson, Merle Quarter, and Edward Warfield, all from Vancouver, Washington, had noticed a man running up and down the trail, calling out some name they couldn't understand. Then he said, "My God, my wife has fallen." He wanted someone to come down and call for help, she explained, so I said I would. With only second-party information, Powell tried to determine just where the fall victim might have gone off the rock so that the ambulance crew and the search and rescue team could concentrate their efforts. So far, he was told, they had been unable to locate the women. He figured that it would be best for them to go into the area from the intersection of Little Road and State Road 14. Under Sheriff Blaisdell arrived to take over the scene, and he talked with the distraught man who said his wife had fallen. He gave his name as Randolph Roth and his address as Mount Lake Terrace, Washington. Roth pointed out an area about 200 feet from the top of Beacon Rock and said his wife Janice had slid over and off at that point. They had been taking a shortcut, one they had taken on a climb earlier in the summer, and he had climbed over the railing and Jan had crawled under. His wife was in the lead, Ross said. She made a sharp right turn. She started to slide on something, dried pine needles, loose dirt, leaves, something. He said he tried to reach out for her, but he wasn't close enough to grab her. As he watched in horror, he said, his wife disappeared from sight. He climbed down as far as he possibly could, trying to find her. He looked down from every vantage point possible, but wasn't able to find her. Ross said he thought maybe he could run down and come up from the bottom to find Jan, but that didn't work either. Desperate, he said he climbed back up and ran down the trail to find the hikers he had seen earlier and asked them for help. He led them up to the spot where he had last seen his wife. None of them spotted her either. Far down below the spot where Janice Roth had fallen, searchers looked for her in vain. Bill Wiley, coordinator for search and rescue in the county and a master at rock climbing, rappelled down the face 200 feet in search for the victim. They were able to pinpoint the area where someone would land, but Janice wasn't there. She should have been. Wiley lowered a weighted rope to indicate the direction of fall. It didn't make any kind of sense. The woman could not have bounced so far off the predictable fall pattern. 2 helicopters, piloted by Jack Caseberg and Tom Nolan, were brought in from the 304th Air Squadron. It was a perilous situation for the searchers. The air currents around Beacon Rock were notoriously treacherous, with sudden wind shears that could tumble the copters themselves down the face of the giant monolith. The backwash of the rotors tugged at Bill Wiley, threatening to knock him from his precarious perch. A paradrumper, who was also a highly trained paramedic, was lowered by a rope from the copter in a vain attempt to spot the missing woman. Down in the parking lot by the sheriff's cars, Randy repeated exactly what Jan had been wearing. Her new jacket was such a bright pink, he said, that she should be easy to spot. He was pale and sweaty as he paced frantically, his face a study in despair. From time to time, he mentioned small things. Climbing Beacon Rock had been Jan's idea. It was her day. She could do what she wanted. I told her it was cold and asked her if she was sure. She was, he said hopelessly. She wanted to be alone with me. Minutes and then hours passed. A score or more searchers raced against sundown. Sandy Cobart, Bob Hoot, Corey Dowdy, Connie Davis, Lester McDonald, and Todd and Sandy McCaldy from the search and rescue team moved above the trail on the west side of Beacon Rock. Helping them were personnel from the Bonneville Fire Department. Greg Hodges, Jay Christensen, Mike Southard, Doug McKenzie, and Jim Duff. The Anderson Rock Climbing Party stayed on to help search too. Finally, the aerial team and the ground searchers, working on a concentrated sweep together, caught a glimpse of Pink in a dense clump of timber halfway down the rock. For the missing woman to have landed in the timber, she would have had to fall at a 45-degree angle from where her husband said she had gone off. Janice Roth lay 300 feet from the top on the west side of the Mammoth Rock. The chance that she had survived was almost minimal. The parajumper from Tom Nolan's helicopter was lowered on a swaying rope harness to where the victim lay while her husband waited for some word of her condition. Blaisdell's radio crackled, and communication between the paramedics and the ground station was audible. The medics were requesting IVs. Blaisdell turned to Randy Roth. It's possible that she's still alive. Randy Roth's face showed joy and relief. That was unmistakable. Policemen are by nature a suspicious lot. Blaisdell studied Randy intensely. The undersheriff figured that if there had been any foul play, Roth would have been stunned and horrified to learn his wife was alive. Randy Roth's expression revealed only elation that his wife was still alive. Blaisdell worried that he might be building up for an emotional crash. It seemed incredible that anyone could have survived that fall with all the stone outcroppings along the way. 15 minutes passed. The word that came over the radio was that Blaisdell was what Blaisdell had expected all along. The small woman in the pink jacket was dead. There was no longer any question of that. She had been carried to a level field where medics got only a flat line on their life pack monitors. They found no signs at all of life. Blaisdell turned to Randy Roth and informed him of the tragic news. Roth began to sob. Then why did they ask for the IVs? He demanded. She must have been alive. I don't know, Blaisdell answered, and he didn't. It took quarter of an hour for the widower to regain any kind of composure. He walked away from Ray Blaisdell to where his car was parked. He was still crying, but he gradually got control of his emotions. When the undersheriff asked if there was anyone he could call, Ross said he would be all right by himself. Can I see her body? Yes, that would be all right, if you could identify her. Janice Roth's shattered body had been carried from a field on the south side of Beacon Rock by Skamania County ambulance crewmen Terry Weber, Dwayne Hathaway, and Sonny Cadow. They had transported her first to the Pierce Ranch and then to the fire hall to await transportation to Straub's funeral home in Camas. She doesn't look so good, one of the medics murmured to Randy, cautioning him. Ashen-faced, Randy Roth leaned into the ambulance to view Janice's body. Silently, he studied his wife as she lay in the ambulance. She doesn't look so bad, he remarked quietly. Her face doesn't seem as badly damaged as I expected. His tone was flat, washed of any emotion at all. Later, Randy remembered that he had to be absolutely sure that Jan was dead, absolutely beyond help, before he could let them take her body to the funeral home. If there was anything at all that could be done for her, he wanted it done. But he could see there was nothing to be done. Jan was dead. He turned away, stumbling toward Blaisdell's patrol car. His voice was suddenly full of tears as he said, "I've seen a lot of deceased people when I was in the service, but I've never had to look at a loved one like this. She didn't smoke and she didn't drink. That's the reason I married her. I loved her very much." He repeated that statement 3 times. Did he mean that literally? Was it so hard to find clean living women had fallen in love with, that Roth had fallen in love with his wife because she had those attributes? Probably not. He was hurting and he was crying, and he probably didn't know exactly what he was saying. The men standing around turned away. What could anyone say? The poor man seemed overwhelmed with grief. Sonny Cadow handed him Janice's engagement ring and wedding band. When Roth asked about the gold necklace that Janice had been wearing, they told him she hadn't been wearing it. It had probably been ripped off as she plummeted 300 feet down Beacon Rock. "Besides you," Blaisdell asked, "who are her next of kin?" "She's got a daughter, Jelena. She's back at my mother's house in Washougal." Roth paused, trying to remember. "She has a mother in Texas someplace, but I don't know her address. I never met any of her folks." As it happened, the on-call ambulance driver from Straub's funeral home in Camas, the first good-sized town along the Columbia River, was ex-homicide detective Dick Reed. Reed had retired in 1979 after working for almost 15 years in the homicide unit of the Seattle Police Department. As he viewed the body of the young woman and listened to the account of what had happened that day, he got what detectives call a hinky feeling. A dozen years later, he still remembered going to the fire hall to pick up the body of the fall victim. It bothered me. Something didn't add up. I suggested to Ray Blaisdell that he at least ask the husband to take a lie detector test, but Ray wasn't receptive at the time. He felt that it had been a terrible accident, that the husband was so grief-stricken that it had to be on the up and up. Dick Reed drove Janice Roth's body back to Straub's funeral home. It was a little before 5 p.m. when he arrived. It wasn't long after that when Randy Roth himself came into the reception area. He was very definite about what he wanted. He paid in full as he insisted that Jan be cremated as soon as possible. She would have wanted that. We've talked about it, and she hated the idea of being in the ground. We promised each other that if anything happened to either of us, the other would see to cremation. It would not be an expensive procedure. Roth explained that he and Jan had also agreed that lavish funerals were a waste and that money should go to take care of the living. He paid Straub's $541. Ironically, it cost him less to dispose of his dead wife's body than it would have to fly Jan and Jelena to Texas for Christmas. Randy was a well-organized man, even in such bleak circumstances. His wallet was equipped with data he might need. He added the number of Janice's insurance policy to the papers he filled out at the funeral home. The last time Sandy Roth had seen her stepson and daughter-in-law, they were happily heading off for a day of Christmas shopping. She expected them home for supper any minute. Instead, Randy called and suggested that everyone come to Camas for pizza. They were all sitting in the restaurant before they noticed Janice wasn't with Randy. He evaded their questions about where she was. Finally, and almost casually, he pushed a receipt of some kind across the table. Sandy looked at it and froze, all color draining from her cheeks. She seemed incapable of saying anything. Marcy pulled it over and gazed without understanding at the piece of paper. "What does this mean?" she asked Randy. "What's cremation? And who's Janice Miranda Roth?" "You know," he answered. "No, I don't know any Janice Roth." "Yes, you do. Think about it." Slowly, the 13-year-old girl understood. She had never heard Janice called anything but Jan. She looked at Jelena, but the little girl clearly didn't comprehend what Randy was saying. Marcy couldn't believe it either. It had to be one of Randy's sadistic jokes. Marcy looked at him. He wasn't crying. He wasn't upset in the least. He was gobbling his pizza hungrily. It was so weird that it couldn't be real. Jan was probably going to walk in any minute with a breathless excuse. Marcy looked at the door as if she could will her new sister-in-law to appear. But the door was closed to keep the cold air out, and nobody appeared. Feeling nauseated and scared, Marcy excused herself to go to the ladies' room. Jelena followed her, talkative and cheerful as always. She didn't realize that something awful might have happened. Marcy herself was only 13. How could she be expected to tell a little kid that her mother might be dead, that she might already be nothing but ashes? The pizza roiled in Marcy's stomach, and it seemed like hours before the rest of the family finished eating and they headed home to bed. As unbelievable as it seemed to Marcy, Jan was dead. Randy hadn't been teasing in the mean way he sometimes did. He was a widower, his bride gone in the flicker of an eye. Randy apparently couldn't bring himself to tell Jelena. As he often remarked, he had never been able to deliver bad news, to say it out loud. But Jelena started asking questions about her mother was. He had to tell her something. He took the little girl aside that evening and told her only that her mother had fallen and was in the hospital. He seemed so calm that Jelena wasn't upset. She expected her mother to come home in a day or so. And that is the end of chapter 2.